Hi guys, today we are going to find out, what if Marco Polo never reached China? You're standing in the bustling port of Venice in 1271, watching as Niccolo and Mafio Polo prepare for what should be their second journey to the court of Kublai Khan. The salty Mediterranean air carries whispers of exotic spices and impossible wealth from distant lands. But today, something goes catastrophically wrong. Maybe it's a sudden illness that strikes young Marco, or perhaps Mongol politics shift and their safe passage evaporates overnight. Whatever the cause, you're witnessing one of history's great what-ifs unfold before your eyes. The teenager who should have become Europe's most famous explorer instead remains in Venice, and with him dies the bridge between East and West that would have changed everything. You probably won't survive the ripple effects of this seemingly small change, because when Marco Polo doesn't make it to China, the entire trajectory of human civilization takes a sharp left turn. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with your location and local time. I'm curious where in our interconnected world you're watching from today. Now sit back and let's dive into today's alternate journey together. You're about to witness how one young man's absence reshapes continents, topples empires, and rewrites the very story of human progress. You're now watching the immediate aftermath ripple across the Mediterranean as news of the Polo's cancelled expedition spreads through Venice's merchant networks. Without Marco's future tales of Chinese silk production methods and advanced printing techniques, European traders remain locked in their traditional patterns. The Muslim merchants of Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad breathe easier as their centuries-old monopoly on East-West trade continues unchallenged. You witness caravans moving freely along established routes, their profits astronomical because Europeans have no idea what lies beyond the Islamic world. In the bazaars of Constantinople, you observe spice merchants setting prices without fear of competition. Pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg flow through their hands like liquid gold, marked up by 1,000% before reaching European tables. The Genoese and Venetian trading houses, traditional rivals, find themselves equally handicapped. You watch as their merchants make increasingly desperate attempts to break into Eastern markets, but without insider knowledge of Chinese innovations or diplomatic connections, they're shooting blind. Meanwhile, in the courts of European nobility, you see a different kind of hunger growing. Lords and ladies crave Eastern luxuries they can barely imagine, driving demand ever higher while supply remains artificially constrained. The Islamic world's technological advantages, superior navigation, advanced mathematics, and established diplomatic relationships create an insurmountable barrier. You're witnessing the solidification of a trade empire that might have lasted centuries longer. You're standing in a European marketplace circa 1300, watching housewives clutch their purses as spice prices climb to impossible heights. Without Marco Polo's detailed accounts of Eastern abundance, Europeans have no leverage in negotiations with Middle Eastern traders. The situation becomes desperate when you witness entire harvests of European crops being traded for tiny quantities of black pepper. What should cost copper coins now demands silver, and luxury spices require gold that most nobles can barely afford. You observe European courts attempting to create substitutes, mixing local herbs to mimic Eastern flavors, experimenting with preservation techniques that fail miserably. The wealthy begin hoarding spices like precious gems, displaying small vials of cinnamon as status symbols. In monastery kitchens across Europe, you watch monks desperately trying to grow exotic plants in completely unsuitable climates. Their gardens become graveyards of failed botanical experiments, each withered seedling representing Europe's growing isolation from Eastern knowledge. The crisis deepens as you see European diets becoming increasingly bland and monotonous. Without access to proper preservation spices, food spoilage increases dramatically, contributing to malnutrition and disease among the lower classes. Most critically, you witness how this spice crisis prevents the development of European maritime technology. Without the burning motivation to bypass Middle Eastern middlemen, shipbuilding advances slowly, and navigational innovations remain theoretical curiosities rather than practical necessities. You're now in the 15th century Portugal, where Prince Henry the Navigator stares at incomplete maps with growing frustration. Without Marco Polo's tantalizing descriptions of Chinese wealth and advanced civilizations, Henry's motivation for maritime exploration lacks its crucial spark. The Portuguese court debates half-heartedly about funding expensive naval expeditions when you witness their primary justification crumbling. Why risk fortunes on uncertain ocean voyages when the rewards remain purely theoretical rather than backed by Polo's detailed accounts of Eastern riches? You observe Portuguese shipbuilders making incremental improvements to their vessels, but without the burning urgency that Marco Polo's stories would have provided, innovation crawls forward at a snail's pace. The revolutionary caravel design emerges decades later than it should have. In Sagres, you watch Henry's navigation school operating with significantly less funding and fewer students. The absence of concrete Eastern destinations means cartographers work with vague rumors rather than specific geographical intelligence that Polo's accounts would have supplied. The African coast exploration continues, but you witness it proceeding more cautiously and methodically. Portuguese captains hug the shoreline, unwilling to venture into open ocean without the compelling vision of Chinese ports that never materialized in European consciousness. Most significantly, you see how this delayed Portuguese momentum creates a completely different timeline for global exploration. The systematic approach to finding sea routes to Asia becomes a low-priority project rather than a national obsession. You're standing in the court of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand in 1485, watching a very different Christopher Columbus pace nervously before the Spanish monarchs. Without Marco Polo's vivid descriptions of Eastern wealth, Columbus struggles to articulate why anyone should fund his westward voyage. The Italian navigator gestures desperately at his maps, but you witness his arguments falling flat. Where he should be referencing Polo's detailed accounts of Chinese gold, Japanese silver mines, and spice islands, Columbus offers only vague theories about reaching the Indies by sailing west. You observe the Spanish court's advisors dismissing Columbus with barely concealed boredom. His mathematical calculations about Earth's circumference sound academic rather than profitable, lacking the concrete promise of Kublai Khan's riches that never entered European consciousness. In this alternate timeline, you watch Columbus eventually securing much smaller funding, enough for perhaps one ship instead of three. His expedition, if it happens at all, becomes a minor exploratory venture rather than a world-changing expedition backed by royal enthusiasm. The crucial difference becomes apparent as you see Spanish nobles calculating risk versus reward. Without Polo's accounts of Eastern magnificence creating golden dreams in European minds, the New World venture seems like an expensive gamble with uncertain returns. Most devastatingly, you witness how this lukewarm support means Columbus either never sails or returns from his voyage to find minimal interest in his discoveries. The Americas remain uncolonized by Europeans for potentially another century. You're now peering through the gates of the Forbidden City in Beijing, where the Ming dynasty has completely sealed China from foreign influence. Without Marco Polo's diplomatic mission establishing European contact, you witness the Middle Kingdom turning even more inward than in our timeline. The Chinese court, never having experienced positive European diplomatic relations, views all Western foreigners with deep suspicion. You observe imperial edicts becoming increasingly restrictive, banning foreign merchants from major ports and limiting trade to heavily controlled border regions. In the imperial libraries, you see Chinese scholars developing their knowledge systems in complete isolation from European Renaissance thinking. Their scientific advances, remarkable in their own right, proceed along entirely different philosophical lines without cross-cultural pollination. You witness Chinese technological innovations, printing, gunpowder, navigation, remaining closely guarded state secrets. Without Polo's accounts spreading awareness of these technologies, Europe develops alternatives independently, often centuries later and through different approaches. The tributary system strengthens as you observe China's neighbors becoming even more dependent on Chinese approval for trade. Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asian kingdoms find themselves locked into increasingly rigid, hierarchical relationships with the Celestial Empire. Most significantly, you watch as Chinese maritime expeditions under Admiral Zheng He proceed without any consideration of European contact. The great treasure fleets explore the Indian Ocean and African coast, but return home convinced that nothing worthwhile exists beyond their established sphere of influence. You're standing in the court of Kublai Khan in 1275, but the atmosphere feels dramatically different without the Polo family's European perspective. The Great Khan rules his vast empire with purely Eastern advisors, missing the cross-cultural insights that Marco Polo would have provided. You observe the Mongol administration developing along strictly traditional lines, incorporating Chinese bureaucratic methods without European innovations in accounting, diplomacy, or military technology. The empire's policies reflect an insular Asian worldview rather than the global perspective Polo might have introduced. The Yuan dynasty's approach to governance becomes more rigidly Chinese as you witness Kublai Khan relying exclusively on Confucian scholars and Buddhist monks for counsel. Without Polo's stories of European political systems, alternative governmental structures never enter imperial consideration. You watch the Mongol postal system, the YAM, operating efficiently but without the international vision that European contact might have sparked. Messages flow across Asia with remarkable speed, but no consideration is given to extending communication networks beyond traditional Mongol territories. In the imperial workshops, you observe Chinese and Persian artisans perfecting their crafts in isolation. The fusion of artistic styles that might have emerged from European influence never materializes, leaving Eastern artistic traditions to develop along purely regional lines. Most critically, you witness how the Mongol Empire's eventual fragmentation proceeds differently. Without European diplomatic connections or alternative perspectives on imperial unity, the empire dissolves into competing khanates that remain permanently isolated from Western political developments. You're walking through Florence in 1400, witnessing a renaissance that unfolds along completely different philosophical lines. Without Marco Polo's accounts of Eastern wisdom, Confucian ethics, and Buddhist philosophy, European humanist thinking develops in pure isolation from Asian intellectual traditions. In the libraries and academies, you observe scholars rediscovering Greek and Roman texts, without the comparative perspective that Chinese philosophy might have provided. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement proceeds without the balancing influence of Eastern concepts of social harmony and collective responsibility. You watch artists like Brunelleschi and Donatello creating revolutionary works, but their innovations emerge purely from European artistic evolution. The fusion techniques, perspective methods, and decorative motifs that might have been inspired by Chinese artistic traditions never materialize in Renaissance masterpieces. The printing revolution takes a different path as you witness Gutenberg's innovations developing independently of Chinese printing methods. European typography and book production advance through trial and error rather than building upon centuries of Eastern printing expertise that remains unknown. You observe European universities expanding their curricula, but mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy develop without access to advanced Chinese mathematical concepts or astronomical observations. European scholars reinvent techniques that Chinese intellectuals had perfected centuries earlier. Most significantly, you see Renaissance humanism becoming more aggressively European-centric. Without exposure to alternative philosophical systems through Polo's accounts, European thinkers develop an intellectual confidence that borders on cultural superiority, setting different foundations for later colonial attitudes. You're standing on the docks of Lisbon in 1450, watching as Portuguese explorers finally begin their systematic push into the Atlantic. But their motivations and methods differ dramatically from our timeline. Without Marco Polo's specific accounts of Eastern riches, exploration becomes more scientific than commercial. You observe Portuguese captains mapping the African coast with methodical precision, but their expeditions lack the desperate urgency that Polo's tales would have provided. Instead of racing to reach Chinese ports, they proceed cautiously, establishing trading posts and studying local cultures with academic curiosity. The breakthrough moment arrives differently as you witness Bartolomeo Dias rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. His achievement opens the Indian Ocean, but without preconceived notions of what awaits in the East. Portuguese encounters with Asian civilizations become more diplomatic and less exploitative. You watch Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, unfolding as genuine exploration rather than a mission to reach predetermined destinations. His interactions with Indian rulers proceed through careful negotiation rather than the aggressive confidence that Polo's accounts might have inspired. The Spanish response takes an entirely different form as you observe them focusing on Atlantic islands and African trade rather than competing directly with Portuguese eastern routes. Without Columbus's successful model of westward exploration, Spanish maritime ambitions remain regional and modest. Most remarkably, You witness the development of multiple alternative exploration strategies. French expeditions head north seeking Arctic passages, while English efforts focus on improving European coastal trade rather than launching ambitious transoceanic voyages toward mythical Eastern empires. You're floating above the world in 1600, surveying a planet that looks fundamentally different from the one you know. Without Marco Polo's bridge between East and West, human civilization has developed along parallel tracks that rarely intersect, creating a world of magnificent isolation. In Europe, you observe a continent that has turned inward, developing its own unique philosophical and technological traditions. The Renaissance bloomed differently. The Reformation took alternative paths, and scientific revolution proceeded through purely European intellectual evolution, creating innovations that are brilliant but limited in scope. Across the vast expanse of Asia, you witness the Chinese Empire reaching unprecedented heights of internal development. Their isolation bred not stagnation but a different kind of perfection. Technological marvels, artistic achievements, and social systems that evolved without external pressure or influence. The Islamic world maintains its role as the crucial link between civilizations, but you see how this monopoly has made them conservative rather than innovative. Their position as cultural middlemen becomes so profitable that they resist technological advancement that might threaten their commercial dominance. You observe the Americas developing along entirely indigenous lines for decades longer. Without European diseases and colonization arriving in the early 1500s, Aztec and Incan civilizations have time to mature, possibly developing their own solutions to European contact when it inevitably comes. The world you're witnessing is neither better nor worse than our timeline, simply profoundly different. Technological development proceeds along multiple independent paths, creating a diversity of human achievement that might have been impossible with early global interconnection. You slowly descend back to Earth, carrying with you the weight of this alternate reality where Marco Polo never reached China. The absence of one young Venetian's journey created a world where civilizations developed in magnificent isolation, each reaching remarkable heights through purely internal evolution. Perhaps this alternate timeline reveals something profound about human nature. That brilliance and innovation don't require cross-cultural contact, but they certainly take different forms when cultures develop independently. The Chinese perfected their systems without European influence, Europeans created their Renaissance without Eastern philosophy, and the Islamic world maintained its crucial role as civilization's bridge. Yet you can't help but wonder what was lost in this world of parallel development. The fusion cuisines that never emerged, the artistic techniques that remained isolated, the philosophical syntheses that never occurred. Each civilization became more purely itself, but perhaps less adaptable to the challenges that would eventually require global cooperation. This reimagined history suggests that human progress isn't linear or inevitable. It's a complex web of connections, accidents, and individual choices. Marco Polo's journey wasn't just about one man's adventure. It was about humanity's first tentative steps toward becoming a truly interconnected species. So what do you think? In our interconnected world, would we be better off with more cultural isolation allowing each civilization to perfect its unique strengths? Or does our current global fusion create innovations impossible in isolation? Drop your thoughts below. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective on whether cultural mixing breeds progress or dilutes authenticity.